A black woman, a respected executive and co-founder of a major airline, arrives at the airport, her mind set on a routine flight to finalize an important business deal. But when she approaches the check-in counter, everything changes. A gate agent, blinded by prejudice, challenges her authority, humiliating her in front of onlookers. The situation escalates quickly, with accusations flying and her credentials questioned without cause. Just 10 minutes later, she's being escorted by security, treated like an outsider in the very company she helped build. What happened next set off a chain of events that shook the airline to its core and sparked a nationwide conversation about race, power, and accountability. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from today. And if this story resonates with you, be sure to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. The early morning light poured through the towering windows of Horizon Air's headquarters. A golden glow casting long, elegant shadows across the sleek conference room. Alexandra Moore, co-founder and executive of the airline, adjusted the cuffs of her tailored navy blazer. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she entered, her head held high, her expression calm. The room fell silent, a quiet that wasn't merely out of respect but also weighted by the unspoken tension that followed her wherever she went. Alexandra had grown accustomed to being the only black woman in spaces like this. She felt the invisible walls of judgment, the skeptical glances questioning her competence, her right to be here. She had built this company, poured every ounce of herself into it. And yet, the weight of having to prove her worth, over and over again, was never far from her mind. Today was monumental. The airline was launching its first international flight, a project she had championed, nurtured, and willed into existence despite countless roadblocks. But as she outlined her vision to the board, her voice steady and persuasive, a part of her remained braced for resistance, for doubt. The meeting concluded with applause. Smiling politely, Alexandra returned to her office, exhaling the tension she hadn't realized she was holding. Her mind wandered to James Anderson, her late mentor, who had once told her, "Alexandra, talent will get you in the room. Grace will keep you there. But resilience, that's what will make them listen." She called her husband, Marcus, to share the victory. His warm humor and steady voice were a balm to her wearied spirit. As they spoke, she allowed herself a brief moment of joy, of pride. But even then, the shadows lingered at the edges of her thoughts. Later that evening, the airport was alive with its usual hum, luggage wheels rattling against tile, flight announcements echoing over the PA system, and passengers weaving through the terminals. Alexandra arrived with her assistant, Evelyn, her leather portfolio tucked securely under her arm. Tonight, she would board the inaugural international flight, a celebration of her hard work. As she approached the first-class check-in counter, she saw Harper Jenkins. The employee looked tired, her eyes heavy with something more than exhaustion. Harper's divorce had been finalized only weeks before, and the financial strain of her new life weighed heavily on her. She was barely holding it together, her patience stretched thin by passengers who often treated her like an extension of the conveyor belt. Alexandra handed over her documents with a polite smile. Harper glanced at her, then at the ticket. For a moment, there was no reaction, but then something shifted. Harper's lips tightened, her eyes lingered on Alexandra, on her blazer, her calm confidence. "This doesn't look right," Harper said, her tone sharp, louder than necessary. Alexandra blinked, surprised by the comment. "Excuse me? I'll need to verify this," Harper continued, her fingers tapping on the keyboard. Alexandra frowned slightly. "Is there an issue with my ticket?" Harper didn't answer immediately, instead staring at the screen. In truth, there was no problem. Alexandra's first-class seat, her itinerary, everything was in perfect order. But Harper couldn't shake the resentment brewing inside her, the unfairness of her own life. The feeling that people like Alexandra always had it easier, always seemed untouchable. Behind Alexandra, the line of passengers began to grow. Whispers rippled through the queue. Alexandra, aware of the eyes on her, kept her voice calm but firm. "If there's a problem, I'd like to know what it is. There's something that doesn't add up," Harper said, her voice colder now. The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, and Alexandra felt the familiar pang of indignation. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned her legitimacy, her right to belong. But this here, In the very space she had helped create felt like a betrayal. "I assure you," Alexandra said, her tone steely, "everything is in order. Check again." But Harper didn't check. Instead, she reached for the phone. Her movements deliberate, almost theatrical. "I'm going to call security," she announced. The hum of the terminal seemed to falter as passengers leaned in to watch. A man in the line muttered to the woman beside him, "First-class passengers shouldn't have to deal with this." Alexandra's jaw tightened, her calm composure beginning to crack. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm not leaving this counter until you resolve this." When the security officers arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. Alexandra stood her ground as they approached, her head high, her expression unyielding. Harper, emboldened by their presence, explained the situation in clipped tones. One officer inspected Alexandra's documents, his expression neutral. "Everything seems fine here," he said, his voice quiet but clear. Alexandra's calm mask slipped for a moment, replaced by visible anger. She turned to Harper, her voice ringing with restrained fury. "You knew there was nothing wrong. You called security to humiliate me." The crowd murmured louder now, their curiosity mingling with discomfort. One woman stepped forward, her voice tentative but firm. "She hasn't done anything wrong. Why is this happening?" But Harper couldn't meet Alexandra's eyes. The officers handed back her documents with a quiet apology, stepping away as the murmurs turned to outright chatter. Alexandra paused, staring at Harper, who now stood frozen behind the counter. "This," Alexandra said, her voice cutting through the noise, "is why we still have so far to go." As she walked toward the gate, the weight of the moment settled heavily on her shoulders. Behind her, a young man lowered his phone, the video of the confrontation already uploading to social media. The caption read, "When success isn't enough. Corporate executive harassed at her own airline. How much longer will this go on?" In that moment, Alexandra knew this was no longer just about her. It was about every silent moment of prejudice, every unspoken bias, and the quiet complicity of a world that allowed it to persist. Tonight, she would board that flight. But tomorrow, the fight would continue. The evening had settled over the airport, casting a warm, golden glow through the terminal windows. Alexandra Moore sat near her gate, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her leather portfolio. The first-class lounge was buzzing quietly, soft conversation, the occasional chime of a phone. It was the kind of tranquil space designed for ease, for comfort, for people who had supposedly made it. But for Alexandra, the calm was deceptive. She felt the weight of the earlier confrontation at check-in, still fresh and sharp. She had endured many such moments in her life. Moments where her competence or her right to exist in certain spaces was questioned without reason. Each time, she had handled them with grace, as James Anderson had taught her, swallowing the sting to keep moving forward. Yet tonight, the weight felt heavier. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about the system that allowed this to happen. Over and over, without consequence. Her thoughts were interrupted by the low hum of her phone. Marcus's name flashed on the screen. She picked it up, grateful for the reprieve. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice steady, a lifeline in the chaos. "I'm fine," she said automatically, though her tone betrayed her exhaustion. Marcus paused, sensing the tension she tried to mask. "Alex, you don't have to pretend with me. What happened?" She hesitated, then sighed. "The usual. Someone decided I didn't belong. This time, it was one of our own employees." He exhaled sharply. "At your airline? After everything you've built?" "Exactly," she said, bitterness creeping into her voice. "It's not about the ticket. It's about power, about control. People like Harper Jenkins see someone like me and decide I must have cheated the system. That I couldn't possibly be where I am without some sort of trickery." Marcus's voice softened. "You've faced worse, Alex, and you've overcome it every time." "I know," she said quietly, "but it never gets easier." The tranquility of the lounge was broken when a security officer entered, his presence stirring an undercurrent of unease. He scanned the room before approaching Alexandra directly. "Mrs. Moore?" he asked, his tone professional but impersonal. "Yes," she said, standing. She felt every eye in the room shift toward her. Curious, judgmental, questioning. "There's been a report filed against you by a staff member. I need you to come with me for further questioning." The words landed like a blow. For a moment, Alexandra could only blink, the absurdity of the situation rendering her speechless. Then anger surged. A report? About what? I've done nothing wrong. It's standard procedure, the officer said, his tone clipped. If you'll follow me. The murmur in the lounge grew louder. Passengers exchanging glances and whispers. Alexandra stood taller, her voice steady but firm. No, I won't follow you. I've provided my documents, and security has already cleared me. This is harassment, plain and simple. The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. She's right. Alexandra turned to see a middle-aged man in a suit step forward. His face set with quiet determination. I was in line behind her earlier. This is ridiculous. Her documents were fine then. And they're fine now. Why are you targeting her? The officer's posture shifted slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But before he could reply, another voice joined in, then another. She's not the problem here. An older woman said firmly. I've been watching how this has unfolded. It's shameful. The tide was turning, but Alexandra knew better than to trust it fully. It was too easy for people to defend her in the moment, only to retreat back into silence once the tension passed. Still, their support gave her a brief flicker of hope, enough to push back harder. I'm not going anywhere, she said to the officer, her voice resolute. If you want to question someone, start with the employee who made the baseless accusation. I have nothing to prove. The officer stepped aside, his hesitation apparent. He spoke into his radio, calling in a supervisor. Alexandra stood firm, her pulse steady but her mind racing. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, some sympathetic, others indifferent, a few openly skeptical. She thought of the young man she had seen earlier, the one filming her confrontation. Was he still recording now? Was this yet another moment that would end up on social media? Her dignity debated by strangers? The supervisor arrived, a woman this time, her demeanor brisk but not unkind. She glanced at Alexandra, then at the officer. What seems to be the issue here? The officer explained, his words halting, his confidence clearly shaken by the passenger's support for Alexandra. The supervisor's eyes flicked toward Alexandra, then to the murmuring crowd, assessing the situation quickly. There's no issue here, Alexandra said before the supervisor could speak. I'm an executive of this airline. My documents are valid. Your officer is acting on a baseless complaint filed by a staff member who's clearly motivated by personal bias. I expect this to be handled appropriately. The supervisor nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Moore, I'll review the details of this myself. Please take a seat for now. We'll ensure this doesn't delay your flight. Alexandra didn't move. No, I want to know what steps are being taken. I want to know what happens to employees who abuse their authority like this. Because if you think I'm just going to sit quietly and let this blow over, you're mistaken. The supervisor's composure wavered, just slightly, before she nodded again. Understood. As Alexandra finally walked toward her gate, the tension in the lounge lingered like a fog. She felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to see the man in the suit who had spoken up earlier. Mrs. Moore, he said, his voice low but sincere. I just wanted to say thank you for standing your ground. She offered a small, tight smile. Thank you for speaking out. Too many people don't. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. It shouldn't have to be this hard. No, she said, her voice quiet but firm. It shouldn't. As she settled into her seat on the plane, Alexandra stared out the window, the city lights below twinkling faintly. She thought of Harper Jenkins, of the officer, of the passengers who had come to her defense. The system that allowed moments like this to exist was still intact, still thriving, and it wasn't going to change unless people like her forced it to. Her phone buzzed with a notification. The video of her confrontation was already spreading, the comments pouring in. Some were supportive, others dismissive, but all of them proved one thing: people were watching. And if they were watching, they could be moved, they could be made to care. Alexandra exhaled, her resolve hardening. The battle wasn't over, but tonight, she had held her ground. Tomorrow, she would fight again. The plane ascended into the night sky, its engines humming steadily as the city lights below dimmed into a soft blur. Alexandra Moore sat by the window, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the dark expanse outside. The physical distance from the confrontation at the airport did little to dull the sting. Every interaction, every whispered comment, every lingering glance still echoed in her mind. She felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. A slow and deliberate tightening. Around her, the first-class cabin was a cocoon of quiet luxury. Passengers were settling in, murmuring to flight attendants, flipping through magazines. To them, this was just another flight. For Alexandra, it was a battlefield she had crossed at great cost. The flight attendant, a young woman with an overly bright smile, approached her seat with a tray of champagne. "Would you like something to drink, Mrs. Moore?" she asked, her voice light and practiced. Alexandra looked up, studying the woman's face for a moment. The attendant's smile faltered under her scrutiny. "No, thank you," Alexandra said, her tone polite but distant. As the attendant moved away, Alexandra's phone buzzed on the tray table. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. Before picking it up, the notification was from Marcus. "Call me when you land. This isn't over." An hour into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed, and most of the passengers had settled into a calm routine. Alexandra tried to focus on the documents in her portfolio, but her mind refused to cooperate. Instead, it circled back to the look on Harper Jenkins' face, the sheer defiance in her eyes, and the quiet complicity of the system that had allowed it to unfold without challenge until Alexandra herself had forced the issue. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint buzz of conversation across the aisle. Two men, seated a few rows ahead, were speaking just loud enough for their words to carry. "Did you see that video going around?" one of them said. His tone tinged with curiosity and derision. "Yeah," the other replied, chuckling softly. "What's the big deal? She was just following protocol. People are so sensitive these days." Alexandra's fingers tightened around the edge of her armrest. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to take a deep breath. But the words continued to grate against her. "People are so sensitive." It was a familiar refrain. A dismissal she had heard too many times before. Unable to stay silent, she turned her head toward them. "Protocol isn't an excuse for bias," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the cabin's quiet. The men froze. Their conversation abruptly halted. One of them, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard, turned to face her. "Excuse me? You said she was just following protocol." Alexandra continued, her voice steady but firm. "But what happens when that protocol is used to mask personal prejudice? What happens when it becomes a weapon to humiliate and exclude?" The man frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't mean anything by it. I just think people blow things out of proportion sometimes." "Do they?" Alexandra asked, leaning forward slightly. "Or is that just easier to say when you're not the one being questioned? Dismissed? Or humiliated?" The second man glanced away, avoiding her gaze. The first opened his mouth as if to respond but found no words. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken tension. The interaction left the cabin quiet, but the unease lingered. Alexandra leaned back in her seat, her heart pounding despite her composed exterior. She was tired of these moments, these endless, exhausting confrontations where she was forced to educate, to justify, to defend her very existence in spaces she had earned her place in. As the flight continued, Alexandra scrolled through her phone, her feed a deluge of notifications. The video of the airport confrontation had gone viral. Comments ranged from supportive to scathing. "This is exactly why we need systemic change. Why is everything about race these days? Good for her for standing up for herself." Entitlement at its finest. Each comment was a reminder of the deeply divided world she lived in, where her dignity was a subject for debate among strangers. When the plane landed, Alexandra was among the first to disembark. The terminal was quieter than the one she had left, but the atmosphere felt no less charged. As she made her way through the airport, she noticed a group of people gathered around a television screen in the lounge. The video from earlier was playing on the news, accompanied by a headline: "Executive challenges bias at her own airline." The anchor's voice was calm, measured, but the story was anything but. "The incident has sparked a larger conversation about racial bias in corporate America," the anchor said. "Many are questioning how such an event could occur in a company co-founded by the victim herself." Alexandra paused, watching as the screen shifted to a panel of commentators. "This isn't an isolated incident," one of them said. "It's emblematic of a culture that continues to marginalize and exclude, even in spaces that are supposed to be progressive." But are we sure this wasn't just a misunderstanding? Another chimed in. We need all the facts before we jump to conclusions. Alexandra turned away, the familiar frustration bubbling beneath her calm exterior. It was always the same minimization. Doubt. The desperate clinging to the idea that prejudice was a thing of the past. A relic that no longer influenced the present. She pulled out her phone and called Marcus. It's everywhere, she said when he answered. I know, he replied, and it's not going away. You need to decide how you're going to respond. I already have, Alexandra said, her voice steady. This isn't just my fight anymore. It never was. As she left the terminal, the city stretched out before her, a vast, sprawling testament to ambition, inequality, and possibility. She knew the days ahead would be relentless. There would be meetings, interviews, debates. Her motives would be questioned, her experiences dissected. But she also knew this. Silence was no longer an option. The storm was building, and Alexandra Moore was ready to face it head-on. The morning sun spilled over the city skyline, casting a pale golden light on Horizon Air's glass-walled headquarters. Alexandra Moore stood in her office, staring at the view she had once found inspiring. Today, the beauty of the city only underscored the tension brewing inside her. On her desk lay a stack of printed emails, messages of support, outrage, and indifference. Each one was a reminder of how the confrontation at the airport had struck a nerve across the country. She hadn't slept much since the incident. Her name, her face, her story, everything was out there. Dissected by news anchors, debated in panel discussions, and scrutinized on social media. Her decision to speak up had transformed her into a symbol. But symbols bore a weight that was difficult to carry. Her assistant, Evelyn, knocked softly before entering, carrying a tablet. The board is expecting you in 15 minutes, she said, her voice cautious. And, the press conference is confirmed for this afternoon. Alexandra nodded, her expression calm but tight. Thank you, Evelyn. As Evelyn left, Alexandra inhaled deeply, summoning the resolve she would need for the hours ahead. Today wasn't just another board meeting. It was a reckoning. The boardroom buzzed with a low murmur as she entered, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The executives seated around the long table straightened in their chairs, their faces a mix of concern, discomfort, and something Alexandra had come to recognize all too well, fear. Not fear of her, but of what her voice might unravel. Thomas Brennan, the interim CEO, gestured for her to take a seat. Alexandra, he began, his tone carefully measured. Thank you for coming. We're all aware of the incident at the airport and the public reaction it has garnered. She held his gaze, waiting for him to continue. We've prepared a statement, he said, sliding a folder toward her. It acknowledges what happened while emphasizing our commitment to inclusivity. We believe this approach will mitigate any further backlash. Alexandra opened the folder and scanned the document. It was polished, precise, and utterly devoid of accountability. Phrases like, unfortunate misunderstanding, and, reaffirming our dedication, leapt off the page. Their vagueness a shield against taking real responsibility. She closed the folder and placed it on the table. Her movements deliberate. This statement, she said, her voice steady but sharp, does nothing. It doesn't address the systemic issues that allowed this to happen. It doesn't acknowledge the harm caused not just to me, but to every employee and passenger who has faced similar treatment. Thomas's brow furrowed. Alexandra, we understand your frustration, but we have to be pragmatic. A stronger statement could alienate stakeholders. Pragmatism isn't an excuse for cowardice, she replied, her voice rising slightly. What happened at that airport wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, one that won't be solved with empty words. The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. For a moment, no one dared to speak. Then Eleanor Grant, the head of public relations, leaned forward. What do you propose? She asked, her tone skeptical but curious. Alexandra met her gaze. I propose we stop hiding behind platitudes. We need to acknowledge the biases ingrained in our culture and commit to meaningful change, mandatory diversity training, transparent reporting systems, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Anything less is a betrayal of our employees, our passengers, and our mission. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That's a tall order, Alexandra. Implementing those changes would be costly and time-consuming. So is silence, She shot back. Do you think the public will forgive us if we sweep this under the rug? Do you think this won't happen again if we don't address it head on? The tension in the room crackled like static. Alexandra knew she was pushing hard. But she also knew she couldn't afford not to. This was the moment to demand more, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or undeserving. The press conference that afternoon was held in a sleek, modern hall on the ground floor of Horizon Air's headquarters. Rows of reporters sat with notebooks and cameras at the ready, their expressions a mix of anticipation and skepticism. The story had dominated headlines for days, and they were eager for answers. As Alexandra stepped onto the stage, the murmurs in the room quieted. She stood at the podium, her hands gripping its edges, her heart pounding, but as she looked out at the sea of faces, she felt a surge of clarity. Good afternoon, she began, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. I'm here today not just as an executive of Horizon Air, but as a black woman who has spent her life navigating spaces that weren't built for people like me. A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. But she pressed on. The incident at the airport was not an anomaly. It was a reflection of the biases that persist in every corner of our society, even in places we like to believe are progressive. It was a reminder that no amount of success, no level of achievement, can shield you from prejudice. Her voice grew stronger, her words sharper. But let me be clear. This is not about one person's actions. It's about a system that allows those actions to go unchecked. And that system must change. The room was silent now. Every eye on her. She could feel the weight of their attention. The tension thick enough to cut. She took a deep breath before continuing. Horizon Air has a responsibility to its employees, its passengers, and the public. That responsibility demands more than apologies. It demands action, and I am committed to ensuring that action is taken. She stepped back from the podium, her chest heaving as she exhaled. The room erupted into a flurry of questions. Cameras flashing, reporters shouting for her attention. But Alexandra felt a sense of calm. She had said what needed to be said. Now, it was up to the world to listen. That evening, as she sat in her office, the city lights twinkling outside her window, Alexandra's phone buzzed with a call from Marcus. You were incredible, he said, his voice warm and proud. It's not enough, she replied, her voice soft but resolute. There's still so much to do. And you'll do it, he said firmly. You always do. She leaned back in her chair, the exhaustion of the day settling into her bones. But even as her body cried out for rest, her mind refused to relent. The storm she had faced was only the beginning. The real fight was just beginning. The morning after the press conference, Alexandra Moore sat at her kitchen table, the faint aroma of coffee filling the air. The house was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic outside. On the screen of her tablet, headlines screamed back at her. Horizon Air executive calls for change amid bias controversy. The cost of speaking out. Alexandra Moore sparks national debate. Injustice at 30,000 feet. A new call for accountability in corporate America. The words blurred together, their implications heavy. Alexandra sipped her coffee slowly, her mind churning. She had taken the first step. But what came next would be harder. Change was never immediate, and the backlash had already begun. Her phone buzzed on the table, vibrating against the wood. It was a message from Marcus. Have you seen the comments? Call me when you're ready. She didn't have to look. She already knew what they said. At Horizon Air's headquarters, the tension was palpable. The press conference had sent shockwaves through the company. And not everyone was pleased. In a meeting room on the 12th floor, a group of senior executives sat in uneasy silence, their expressions a mixture of concern and frustration. Thomas Brennan, the interim CEO, paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back. This situation is spiraling, he said, his voice tight. The media is running with it. Employees are on edge, and stakeholders are asking questions we don't have answers to. Eleanor Grant, the head of public relations, leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. What did you expect? Alexandra didn't just make this about her experience, she made it about us. Now the spotlight's on everything we've ignored for years. Thomas stopped pacing and turned to her. And what do you propose we do? Eleanor? Implement every demand she made overnight? That's not realistic. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Doing nothing isn't realistic either. Alexandra's right, this isn't just about one incident. If we don't act, We'll lose more than just public trust. The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on them all. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the city, Harper Jenkins sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at her laptop screen. The video from the airport had gone viral, and her face was unmistakable. The comments were brutal. This woman needs to be fired. How do people like this even get hired in the first place? Another example of systemic bias in action. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, notifications piling up from friends, family, and strangers alike. Harper's stomach churned. She had told herself she was just following procedure. But deep down, she knew better. Her decision at the counter hadn't been about protocol, it had been about power. About the quiet, bitter resentment she carried every day. The door creaked open, and her teenage daughter, Grace, stepped into the room. "Mom," she said hesitantly, holding up her phone. "I saw the video." Harper's breath caught. She couldn't meet Grace's eyes. "I didn't mean for it to. I didn't think." Grace cut her off, her voice shaking. "But you did. And now everyone's talking about it. Don't you see how wrong it was?" Harper's chest tightened as tears pricked her eyes. She didn't have an answer. Back at Horizon Air, Alexandra's day was only growing more complicated. In her office, she met with a small group of employees, members of the airline's Diversity and Inclusion Council. They were supposed to be allies, but the tension in the room was thick. "We appreciate your passion, Alexandra," one of them said cautiously. But the press conference, it stirred up a lot of feelings. "What kind of feelings?" Alexandra asked, her voice calm but pointed. "Resentment," another replied. "Some employees feel like they're being unfairly blamed. They think you've painted the entire company as biased." Alexandra leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "If they feel defensive, maybe they should ask themselves why. This isn't about blame, it's about accountability. And if we're not willing to hold ourselves accountable, how can we expect anything to change?" The room fell silent. No one had an answer. As the day wore on, the backlash Alexandra had anticipated began to take shape. Social media buzzed with debate. News outlets reached out for interviews, and employees whispered in the hallways. Some praised her courage, while others accused her of grandstanding. But the most unsettling moment came late in the afternoon when an anonymous email landed in her inbox. "You think you're a hero, but all you're doing is dividing people. Stop pretending you're better than the rest of us. You're not." The words were simple, but the venom behind them was unmistakable. Alexandra stared at the screen, her hands trembling slightly. She had prepared herself for criticism, but the personal attacks were harder to bear than she'd expected. That evening, Marcus found her sitting on the couch, her shoulders slumped, her face drawn with exhaustion. He placed a gentle hand on her back. "You've done something incredible," he said softly. "It doesn't feel incredible," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It feels impossible." Marcus knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Change always feels impossible until it happens. And it's happening because of you." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep going." "You are," he said firmly. "And you're not alone. I'm with you. Always." As the night deepened, Alexandra sat by the window, gazing out at the city. The challenges ahead loomed large, but so did the possibilities. The confrontation at the airport had exposed the fractures beneath the surface. But it had also opened the door to something greater. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. The storm was far from over, but Alexandra Moore was ready to weather it. The following morning, Alexandra Moore arrived at Horizon Air's headquarters earlier than usual. The city was just beginning to stir. The streets bathed in a soft, muted light, but inside the gleaming tower, the atmosphere was anything but tranquil. Whispers and hurried footsteps echoed through the hallways as employees exchanged worried glances. The company was no longer just managing a crisis, it was navigating a reckoning. Alexandra entered the executive conference room, where the air was heavy with tension. The usual formality of such meetings had been replaced with an undercurrent of unease. Thomas Brennan, the interim CEO, sat at the head of the table, his expression strained. Eleanor Grant, the head of PR, was typing furiously on her laptop, her face a mask of concentration. Other senior executives sat rigidly, avoiding Alexandra's gaze. "Let's begin," Thomas said, his voice clipped. "As you all know, The fallout from the incident continues to grow. Public trust is wavering, and we're seeing more calls for action from both internal and external stakeholders. Alexandra remained silent, watching as Eleanor projected a series of graphs onto the screen at the front of the room. They showed plummeting approval ratings, spikes in negative press coverage, and a growing divide in employee morale. This is unsustainable, Thomas continued. We need to contain this before it causes irreparable damage. Alexandra finally spoke, her tone measured but firm. Containment isn't the solution, Thomas. Transformation is. And that starts with us acknowledging the problem. Thomas's jaw tightened. We've acknowledged it. The press conference wasn't enough. Alexandra interrupted, her voice cut through the room like a blade. We need concrete actions, not vague assurances. The world is watching, and so are our employees. They need to see that we're serious about change. By midday, the tension had spilled out of the conference room and into the wider office. Employees were whispering in break rooms and huddling in corners, their conversations laced with uncertainty and fear. An emergency town hall meeting was called, and the company's main auditorium filled with staff from every department. Alexandra stood backstage, watching as Thomas took the podium. His opening remarks were safe, rehearsed. He spoke of challenges and opportunities, of the company's commitment to doing better. But as his speech dragged on, Alexandra could feel the audience growing restless. This wasn't what they wanted to hear. When her name was called, Alexandra stepped forward. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. She could feel the weight of their expectations, their doubts, their hopes. Taking a deep breath, she began. I know many of you feel uncertain right now, she said. You've seen the headlines, the videos, the commentary. You've heard about what happened at the airport, and you're wondering what it means for our company and for you. She paused, scanning the room. Let me be clear. What happened was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the biases that exist in our culture, biases that we've ignored for too long. And that's on all of us. Her words hung in the air, heavy and unflinching. She saw some employees shift uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in quiet agreement. But acknowledging the problem is only the first step. She continued. The real work lies in addressing it. That's why I'm calling for immediate reforms, mandatory diversity and inclusion training, the creation of an independent oversight committee, and a transparent reporting system for incidents of discrimination. These aren't suggestions, they're necessities. The room erupted into murmurs, a mix of agreement and skepticism. Alexandra held up a hand, silencing the crowd. I know change is hard, she said, her voice rising, but it's necessary, not just for our reputation, but for our integrity, for the kind of company we want to be. As the meeting concluded, the reactions were as divided as Alexandra had expected. Some employees approached her afterward, thanking her for speaking up. Others avoided her entirely, their expressions guarded. She knew she was stirring the pot, challenging long-held assumptions and comfortable routines. But that was exactly what needed to happen. Later that afternoon, Alexandra returned to her office to find a handwritten note waiting on her desk. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside, the note read, "You don't speak for all of us. Stop making this about race. Some of us just want to do our jobs without the drama." Her stomach churned as she read the words. It wasn't the first time she had received such a message, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But that didn't make it any easier to bear. She sat down heavily in her chair, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She thought of Harper Jenkins, of the employees who felt emboldened to resist change, of the anonymous voices who preferred the status quo. The road ahead felt impossibly long, the obstacles insurmountable. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was Marcus. "How's it going?" he asked when she answered. "Exhausting," she admitted. "I feel like I'm fighting a battle on every front." "And you are," he said, "but you're not fighting alone." His words gave her strength. Even as the doubts lingered, she knew this was only the beginning. The pushback would grow stronger, the resistance more entrenched. But she also knew that real change was never easy. And she was prepared to fight for it. That evening, as she sat at her desk reviewing the proposed reforms, Alexandra's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from social media. A young employee had posted a photo of her speaking at the town hall, accompanied by the caption, "Real leaders don't just talk, they act. Thank you, Alexandra Moore." For standing up for what's right. Alexandra allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. The road ahead was daunting. But moments like this reminded her why she had to keep going. The storm was far from over. But she would face it. One battle at a time. The day after the town hall meeting, Alexandra Moore arrived at Horizon Air's headquarters with a mix of determination and apprehension. The reactions from the employees had been as divided as she'd anticipated. Some expressed hope, while others responded with resistance thinly veiled as apathy. But beneath the surface, a new tension was brewing. It wasn't just about the reforms she had proposed, it was about what they represented. A challenge to the comfortable, unspoken status quo. The building buzzed with an energy that felt volatile, like a storm cloud ready to break. In the elevator, Alexandra overheard two employees whispering. Their voices were hushed but not enough to escape her notice. "This is all going too far." One said, "Why do we all have to suffer because of one incident?" "It's not just one incident," the other replied, though their tone lacked conviction. "They say there've been complaints for years." "Yeah, well, not everything's about race," the first snapped. Alexandra stepped off the elevator, her stomach tightening. It wasn't just the words, it was the fatigue of hearing them over and over again. Each time wrapped in the same refusal to confront reality. In her office, Alexandra met with Marcus, who had taken a morning off from his law practice to support her. He stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the city skyline. "The pushback's growing," she said, leaning against her desk. "I can feel it." Marcus turned, his expression thoughtful but firm. "You knew it would. Change always makes people uncomfortable, especially when it forces them to confront things they've ignored. But it's not just discomfort," Alexandra replied. "It's anger, resentment. It's this deep, ingrained belief that acknowledging bias is somehow an attack on them." Marcus nodded. "And that's exactly why you have to keep pushing. Because if you don't, nothing changes." By midday, the tension reached a boiling point. A leaked memo began circulating among employees, sent anonymously but clearly written by someone inside the company. The memo criticized Alexandra's proposed reforms, calling them unnecessary overcorrections, and claiming they would create more division than unity. The language was polished, careful not to cross overt lines. But the subtext was clear, a rejection of accountability disguised as concern for the company's culture. The memo quickly became the subject of heated debate in break rooms and online forums. When Alexandra learned about it, she felt a familiar mix of anger and weariness. The words were designed to undermine her efforts without openly opposing them, a subtle weapon. But a weapon nonetheless. "Have you seen this?" Evelyn asked, stepping into Alexandra's office with a printout of the memo. "I have," Alexandra said, her voice tight. She skimmed the document again, though every word was already seared into her mind. "It's exactly what I expected. The resistance was never going to be direct, it was always going to hide behind plausible deniability." "What do you want to do?" Evelyn asked. Alexandra thought for a moment before responding. "We address it head on. Schedule another meeting with the board and the department heads. If they want a debate, I'll give them one." The meeting was tense from the moment it began. The department heads filed into the room with guarded expressions, some clutching copies of the memo as though it were a shield. Alexandra took her seat at the head of the table, her posture straight, her gaze steady. "Let's get right to it," she said. "I'm sure you've all seen the memo that's been circulating. I'd like to hear your thoughts." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Richard Lawson, the head of operations, cleared his throat. He was an older man with a gruff demeanor, someone who had been with the company since its inception. "Alexandra," he began, his tone measured, "I think we all understand the importance of addressing these issues. But there's a concern that the changes you're proposing are heavy-handed." "Heavy-handed?" Alexandra repeated, her voice sharp. "How is holding ourselves accountable heavy-handed?" "It's not about accountability," Richard said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It's about balance. We can't let one incident define the entire company." "One incident?" Alexandra's voice rose slightly. "Do you really believe this is an isolated case? Do you think the biases that allowed this to happen only existed in that moment?" Richard shifted uncomfortably, but before he could respond, Eleanor Grant spoke up. "Alexandra's right," she said. "We've had complaints about bias and discrimination for years. We just haven't taken them seriously." Her admission hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Alexandra seized the moment. "This isn't about blame," she said, her voice steady but firm. "It's about taking responsibility. And if we don't, the consequences won't just be public backlash. They'll be the loss of trust from our employees and passengers. Is that the kind of company we want to be?" The room was silent. Some of the department heads looked uncomfortable, while others nodded subtly. The tension remained, but for the first time, Alexandra felt a small shift, a crack in the wall of resistance. That evening, as Alexandra walked to her car, she noticed a small group of employees gathered near the entrance. They were speaking quietly, their faces lit by the glow of a phone screen. As she approached, one of them turned and hesitated. "Mrs. Moore," the employee said, their voice tentative. "Can we talk?" Alexandra stopped, her exhaustion momentarily pushed aside. "Of course." The group exchanged nervous glances before one of them spoke. We wanted to thank you for standing up for us, for saying what needed to be said." Alexandra felt a lump rise in her throat. "You don't have to thank me," she said, "but I appreciate it." The employee nodded. "It means a lot, more than you know." As Alexandra drove home, their words stayed with her. They were a reminder of why she was fighting, even when the resistance felt overwhelming. For every voice trying to silence her, there were others quieter, perhaps, but just as important, who were ready to stand with her. That night, Alexandra sat in her living room, a cup of tea in her hands. Marcus joined her, his presence a comforting weight beside her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired," she admitted, "but hopeful." Marcus smiled. "You should be. You're starting something that can't be stopped." She nodded, the truth of his words settling over her like a bomb. The road ahead was still long, the challenges still daunting, but for the first time in days, Alexandra felt a glimmer of optimism. The fault lines were beginning to shift, and with them, the possibility of true, lasting change. The crisp morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Horizon Air's conference room, casting long, angular shadows on the polished mahogany table. Alexandra Moore sat at one end, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Across the room sat Thomas Brennan, his face carefully neutral but his body language tense. To his right was Eleanor Grant, whose usual composure now seemed frayed at the edges. The remaining department heads were scattered around the table, their expressions ranging from guarded to outright skeptical. The meeting was already off to a rocky start. The agenda, Alexandra's proposed reforms, had been derailed by what could only be described as passive-aggressive resistance. For every solution she offered, a counter-argument emerged, cloaked in the language of logistical challenges or financial prudence. The air was thick with unspoken tensions, the kind that couldn't be addressed with a polite clearing of the throat. "I'm not sure we can allocate the budget for these diversity training programs right now," Richard Lawson said, his tone careful but dismissive. "We're already stretched thin with operational costs." Alexandra's gaze sharpened. "So what's the cost of doing nothing?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. "What's the cost of ignoring the biases that have already damaged our reputation and alienated employees and passengers alike?" Richard hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "It's not about doing nothing," he said weakly. "It's about timing." "Timing?" Alexandra repeated, leaning forward. "The time to address these issues was years ago. We're already behind, and every moment we delay, we're sending a message that we don't care enough to act." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Eleanor glanced at Thomas, her expression unreadable, before clearing her throat. "Alexandra's right," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "We've ignored these issues for too long. If we're serious about rebuilding trust, we can't afford to keep dragging our feet." Thomas shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "No one is saying we shouldn't act," he said carefully, "but we need to ensure we're acting in a way that doesn't disrupt the company's operations." Alexandra's patience, already worn thin, snapped. "Thomas, this is the company's operation. Creating an inclusive, equitable workplace isn't a side project, it's fundamental to who we are and what we stand for. If we can't prioritize this, what are we even doing here?" The meeting adjourned with no clear resolution, but the tension lingered. Alexandra returned to her office, her thoughts swirling. She knew change was hard, that it required uncomfortable conversations and difficult decisions. But she hadn't anticipated just how deeply entrenched the resistance would be, not just from external forces, but from within the very walls of the company she'd helped build. As she sat at her desk, Her phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "How's it going?" he asked. His voice steady. A lifeline in the storm. "Frustrating," she admitted. "It's like pulling teeth to get anyone to take this seriously. They smile. They nod. But when it comes time to act, all I get are excuses. You're pushing against a wall that's been standing for decades." Marcus said. "It's not going to crumble overnight." "I know," Alexandra said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "But it feels like for every step forward, there's someone pulling me 2 steps back." Marcus paused. "You've always been the one to make them listen. Alex, this is no different." By mid-afternoon, the cracks in Horizon Air's facade were becoming harder to ignore. Employees were whispering in hallways. Online forums were buzzing with heated debates. And the anonymous memo had gained traction outside the company. News outlets were now framing the controversy as a broader struggle over corporate accountability, with Alexandra at the center. In the break room, Harper Jenkins sat quietly at a corner table, scrolling through her phone. The backlash against her actions had not abated, and the isolation she felt within the company was suffocating. Colleagues avoided her, their gazes darting away whenever she entered a room. She knew she had brought this on herself. But that didn't make it any easier to bear. The door opened, and Tom Parker, a junior employee who had been outspoken in support of Alexandra's reforms, walked in. He hesitated when he saw Harper. But instead of turning away, he approached her table. "Harper," he said cautiously, "can I sit?" She nodded, too tired to argue. "I wanted to say something," Tom began, his voice quiet but firm. "I know this has been hard on you. And I know what you did was wrong. But I also think you have a chance to make it right." Harper looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. "I don't know if I can," she said softly. "People have already made up their minds about me." Tom shook his head. "It's not about what they think. It's about what you do next. You can choose to stay quiet. Or you can choose to be part of the change." That evening, Alexandra was preparing to leave the office when Evelyn walked in, her expression serious. "You need to see this," Evelyn said, handing Alexandra a tablet. On the screen was a news segment. The headline reading, "Horizon Air Under Fire. Employees Divided Over Diversity Reforms." The anchor's voice filled the room. As Horizon Air faces growing scrutiny, insiders report a deepening divide within the company. While some employees support the proposed reforms, others question their necessity, calling them a distraction from the airline's core operations. The screen cut to an interview with an anonymous employee. Their voice altered and face blurred. "I just feel like these changes are being forced on us," the employee said. "Not everyone agrees with them. But no one feels safe speaking out." Alexandra felt a surge of anger and frustration. The narrative was being hijacked, twisted into something it wasn't. She turned to Evelyn. "Schedule another town hall," she said. "If people want to question the necessity of these reforms, I'll answer them directly." As Alexandra drove home, the weight of the day settled heavily on her shoulders. The road ahead felt impossibly long, the resistance more entrenched than ever. But as she pulled into her driveway, she noticed a message on her phone. It was from Tom Parker. "Mrs. Moore, thank you for everything you're doing. Some of us see it, even if it feels like most don't. Please don't stop." Alexandra sat in her car for a moment, the message glowing softly on the screen. It was a small thing, but it reminded her of why she was fighting. For every voice of resistance, there was another quietly hoping for change. She stepped out of the car, her resolve hardening once more. The battle was far from over. But Alexandra Moore had no intention of backing down. The fault lines were widening, and the fight for accountability was only just beginning. The morning light filtered into Alexandra Moore's office, reflecting off the polished desk that now felt more like a battleground than a place of work. The town hall had been announced for later that afternoon, and the atmosphere within Horizon Air's headquarters was growing heavier with every passing hour. Alexandra could feel it in the way employees avoided her gaze in the hallways, in the hushed conversations that ceased when she entered a room. The tension wasn't just palpable, it was suffocating. Her assistant, Evelyn, entered with a stack of papers. "The talking points for the town hall," Evelyn said, her voice subdued. "There's also a new batch of employee feedback. I thought you'd want to see it." Alexandra took the papers and flipped through them. Most of the feedback echoed what she'd already heard, a mix of support, skepticism, and outright hostility. One comment stood out, scrawled in sharp, angry handwriting. This isn't your fight. Alexandra, stop forcing your agenda on the rest of us. She closed the folder and set it aside, her jaw tightening. She had expected resistance, but the personal nature of the backlash still stung. This wasn't just about the reforms, it was about her. Her identity, her voice, her very presence in a space where many still believed she didn't belong. By noon, the pressure had reached a breaking point. An email thread among middle management had been leaked to the press. Its contents damning. Several managers had expressed doubts about Alexandra's leadership, questioning whether she was too focused on personal grievances to lead effectively. The leak spread like wildfire, dominating the day's headlines. Marcus called as soon as the news broke. "Alex, have you seen this?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "I've seen it," she replied curtly. "Do you know who leaked it?" "No," she said, exhaling sharply, "but I have a pretty good idea of why they did." "Are you okay?" Marcus asked. "I don't have time not to be," she replied. "There's a town hall in 3 hours. I need to focus." As the clock ticked closer to the town hall, the mood in the building became electric. Employees gathered in clusters, their conversations hushed but intense. Some were excited, hoping for clarity and direction. Others were nervous, anticipating conflict. Everyone seemed to sense that this meeting would be a turning point. Harper Jenkins sat in a corner of the employee lounge, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long gone cold. She had avoided attending the previous town halls, but this time felt different. She couldn't shake Tom Parker's words from the day before. "You can choose to stay quiet. Or you can choose to be part of the change." For the first time, she felt the faintest flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in weeks: resolve. She didn't know what she would say if given the chance, but she knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. The auditorium was packed by the time Alexandra took the stage. She stood at the podium, her hands resting lightly on its edges, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. The room was silent, the tension almost unbearable. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Thank you all for being here." She paused, letting the quiet stretch for a moment. "I know the past few weeks have been difficult. For many of you, this has felt like uncharted territory, like everything you thought you knew about this company, about each other, is being questioned, and I understand why that's unsettling." Her voice grew stronger, more resolute, but discomfort is not an excuse to avoid accountability. Change is never easy. It forces us to confront things we would rather ignore: our biases, our blind spots, our complicity. But it is only through that discomfort that we grow. From the back of the room, Harper listened intently, her heart pounding. She had expected Alexandra to come out swinging, to respond to the leaked email and the backlash with the same fire she'd shown in previous meetings. Instead, Alexandra's words carried a quiet strength, a steadiness that made it impossible not to listen. "I want to address something head-on," Alexandra continued, her tone sharp now. "The idea that these reforms are about me, that I'm using my position to push a personal agenda. Let me make this clear. This is not about me. This is about all of us. It's about ensuring that every employee and every passenger who walks through our doors is treated with dignity and respect." She stepped away from the podium, her voice rising with conviction. "I know there are those among you who disagree with what I'm doing, who think these changes are unnecessary or divisive. To you, I say this: I'm not here to make you comfortable. I'm here to make things right." The room erupted into murmurs, some supportive, others skeptical. Alexandra let them talk for a moment before raising her hand for silence. "This company is at a crossroads," she said. "We can either continue down the path of complacency, pretending that bias and discrimination aren't our problem, or we can choose to lead to be a company that doesn't just talk about values but lives them." As the town hall drew to a close, Alexandra opened the floor for questions. The first few were measured, cautious. Then, a man in the middle of the room stood up. He was tall, with graying hair and a voice that carried easily across the auditorium. "With all due respect, Mrs. Moore," he said, "how do you expect us to move forward when you've divided this company so deeply? Isn't unity more important than addressing grievances?" Alexandra's gaze locked onto his. "Unity without accountability isn't unity, it's complicity," she said firmly. "And it's not me who divided this company. The division was always there, beneath the surface. All I've done is expose it." The man sat down, his expression unreadable. From the corner of the room, Harper watched, her hands trembling. For the first time, she saw the weight Alexandra was carrying not just for herself, but for everyone in the room. When the meeting ended, the reactions were as divided as ever. Some employees lingered to thank Alexandra, while others left quickly, their expressions tight with frustration. Harper stayed in her seat, watching as Alexandra gathered her things. Finally, she stood and approached the stage. Alexandra noticed her and paused, her eyes narrowing slightly in recognition. "Mrs. Moore," Harper began, her voice shaky but earnest. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything." Alexandra studied her for a moment before nodding. "Thank you," she said simply. "But if you're serious about making things right, it's going to take more than an apology." Harper nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know, and I'm ready." That night, Alexandra sat in her living room, a blanket draped over her lap. The town hall had been exhausting, but it had also been a turning point. The fault lines were still there, but they were shifting, cracking open to reveal the possibility of something new. As she sipped her tea, her phone buzzed with a message from Evelyn. "The feedback is already coming in. Most of it positive. You're making an impact." Alexandra smiled faintly, the weight of the day lifting just slightly. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The battle wasn't over, but progress was finally within reach. The days following the town hall were anything but calm. Horizon Air was a company divided, its employees and leadership caught in the crossfire of change. The reforms Alexandra Moore had championed were no longer just proposals, they were battle lines. Meetings turned into debates, debates into arguments, and the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Alexandra knew she was running out of time. The board was meeting in 3 days to vote on her proposals, and the outcome was uncertain. The leaked memo had emboldened her detractors, while the town hall had rallied her supporters. But it wasn't enough. She needed to sway the undecided, the ones afraid of taking a stand, of risking their positions in a company built on unspoken rules. It was late afternoon when Alexandra received a call from Tom Parker, the junior employee who had defended her during the town hall. "Mrs. Moore," he began, his voice hesitant but earnest. "I think you should know, there's been another email circulating. This one's worse." "Worse how?" Alexandra asked, her tone sharp. "It's personal," Tom said. "Someone's accusing you of using this whole thing as a publicity stunt. They're saying you're only doing this to boost your profile." Alexandra felt her chest tighten. "Do you know who sent it?" "No," Tom admitted, "but it's spreading fast. People are talking about it in the break rooms, on the internal forums. Some are defending you, but not everyone." Alexandra thanked him and ended the call. She sat at her desk, her hands clenched into fists. The accusation wasn't new, she'd faced it before, from people who couldn't see her advocacy as anything other than self-serving. But hearing it now, after everything she'd endured, felt like a slap in the face. That evening, Alexandra met with Marcus at their favorite cafe, a quiet spot tucked away from the bustling city streets. She needed the comfort of his steady presence, the reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. "They're attacking my character now," she said, stirring her tea absently. "As if I haven't worked my entire life to prove myself." Marcus leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You've always known this was about more than proving yourself. This fight isn't about them liking you, it's about forcing them to confront the truth." Alexandra nodded, her resolve hardening. "The board vote is in 3 days. If I can't get them to see the bigger picture, all of this will have been for nothing." "You'll get them to see it," Marcus said firmly, "because you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for everyone who comes after you." The next morning, Alexandra arrived at the office to find her assistant, Evelyn, waiting with a stack of documents. "These are the latest metrics on employee feedback," Evelyn said, "and there's something else you need to see." She handed Alexandra a printed email, the same one Tom Parker had warned her about. The language was scathing, dripping with resentment. "Alexandra Moore is turning this company into her personal soapbox. She doesn't care about Horizon Air, she cares about her own agenda. If she really wanted to make a difference, she'd stop grandstanding and let the rest of us do our jobs." Alexandra's stomach churned, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Who's backing this?" she asked. Evelyn hesitated. "It's hard to say, but I've heard Richard Lawson's name come up a few times." Of course, Alexandra thought. Richard had been the most vocal opponent of her reforms. hiding his resistance behind concerns about budgets and logistics. But now, his opposition was becoming more personal and more dangerous. 2 days before the vote, Alexandra convened a meeting with the board's key undecided members. She knew this was her last chance to sway them, to counter the narrative that her detractors were spreading. The meeting was tense from the start. The room was filled with the hum of polite hostility, the kind that came from people too practiced to show their true feelings outright. "I'll get straight to the point," Alexandra said, her voice steady but firm. "You've seen the proposals. You know what's at stake. But this isn't just about policies, it's about who we are as a company." One of the board members, a middle-aged woman named Linda Martinez, leaned forward. "Alexandra, no one's questioning the importance of inclusivity," she said, "but some of these measures, they're drastic. Are you sure they're what we need right now?" "Linda, with all due respect," Alexandra replied, "if not now, then when? How many more incidents have to happen before we take this seriously? How many more employees have to feel unseen, unheard, unvalued?" Linda glanced away, clearly uncomfortable. Another board member, a younger man named David Cho, spoke up. "I think what some of us are struggling with is the perception issue. The backlash has been intense. If we go all in on these reforms, what message does that send to our shareholders?" Alexandra's patience was wearing thin, but she kept her tone calm. "It sends the message that we're willing to lead, that we're not afraid to do what's right, even when it's hard. And if our shareholders can't see the value in that, then maybe we're not the company we claim to be." The meeting ended with no clear answers, but Alexandra knew she had made an impact. Linda and David both seemed conflicted, their earlier resistance softening into uncertainty. It wasn't a victory, but it was a step forward. The night before the vote, Alexandra received an unexpected visitor, Harper Jenkins. She stood in the doorway of Alexandra's office, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mrs. Moore," Harper began, her voice trembling, "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, but I need to say something." Alexandra gestured for her to sit. Harper hesitated before taking a seat, her eyes downcast. "I was wrong," Harper said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About everything. About you. About this company. And I know an apology isn't enough. But I want to help. I want to make things right." Alexandra studied her for a long moment. She could see the fear in Harper's eyes, the shame that clung to her like a shadow. But she could also see something else, a spark of genuine remorse. "If you're serious about helping," Alexandra said, "then start by telling your story. People need to hear it not from me, but from someone who's been where you've been." Harper nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'll do whatever it takes." As Alexandra prepared for bed that night, she felt the familiar weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. The outcome of the vote was still unclear, and the battle ahead was far from over. But for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a glimmer of hope. The fault lines were shifting. The resistance was still strong, but cracks were beginning to appear, and Alexandra Moore was ready to push them wider. The morning of the board vote arrived with a heavy stillness that seemed to press against every corner of Horizon Air's headquarters. Alexandra Moore sat in her office, staring out at the city skyline. The calm outside was a stark contrast to the storm brewing within the company. Today was the culmination of weeks of conflict, tension, and hard-fought battles. Her phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "Big day," he said, his voice steady, a quiet anchor in the chaos. "Big day," she echoed, her tone more restrained. "You've done everything you can, Alex," he said. "No matter what happens, you've already changed the conversation." "That's not enough," she replied, her voice firmer now. "Changing the conversation isn't the same as changing the system. Today isn't about words, it's about action." The boardroom was a place of contradictions that morning, elegant and austere, yet thick with tension. The long mahogany table gleamed under the soft glow of overhead lights. Around it sat the board members, their faces a mix of guarded neutrality and barely concealed anxiety. At the head of the table was Thomas Brennan, who looked like he'd aged a decade in the past few weeks. Alexandra took her seat, her back straight, her expression calm but unyielding. On the table in front of her was the packet outlining her proposed reforms: mandatory diversity training, transparent accountability measures, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee. Thomas began the meeting with his usual measured tone. "Before we proceed to the vote, I believe it's only fair to allow Alexandra the opportunity to address the board one final time. She nodded and stood, her hands resting lightly on the table's edge. Thank you, Thomas, she began, her voice steady but laced with urgency. I won't take up too much of your time. You've all seen the proposals. You've heard the arguments. But I want to remind you of something that's easy to forget when we're sitting in a room like this. Removed from the day-to-day experiences of our employees and passengers. This isn't about policies or protocols. It's about people. It's about the lives we affect with every decision we make or fail to make. She paused, scanning the room. Some board members met her gaze, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I've heard the objections, she continued. I've heard the excuses. It's too expensive. It's too disruptive. It's too divisive. But the truth is, those aren't reasons, they're rationalizations. They're ways to avoid confronting the uncomfortable truth. That we've allowed a culture of complacency to flourish. And it's hurt people, good people, people who deserve better from us. Her voice rose slightly, the passion behind her words unmistakable. If we don't act now, we're not just failing them, we're failing ourselves. We're failing the very principles we claim to stand for. When Alexandra sat down, the room was silent, the air heavy with the weight of her words. Thomas cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. Thank you, Alexandra, he said. We'll now proceed with the vote. As the board members cast their votes, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Alexandra sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The stakes higher than they had ever been. Meanwhile, outside the boardroom, employees gathered in the break rooms, their eyes glued to screens showing live updates. Harper Jenkins stood among them, her heart pounding. She had spent the past few days speaking with colleagues, sharing her story, and advocating for the reforms. It hadn't been easy. Many were skeptical of her motives, while others were openly hostile. But she had pressed on, driven by a need to make amends. Do you think the board will pass it? Someone asked. I don't know, Harper replied honestly, but I hope so. It's the right thing to do. Back in the boardroom, Thomas tallied the votes and then looked up, his face unreadable. The board has reached a decision, he said, by a narrow margin. The proposed reforms have been approved. The room erupted into murmurs, some relieved, others visibly displeased. Alexandra allowed herself a small, fleeting smile, a rare moment of triumph in a battle that had been anything but easy. The announcement spread through the company like wildfire. Supporters of the reforms cheered, their hope renewed. Critics fumed, their frustrations simmering beneath the surface. But one thing was clear: Horizon Air was changing, and there was no turning back. Harper sat at her desk, a mixture of relief and resolve washing over her. She knew the vote was just the beginning. The hard work of implementation, of rebuilding trust, of holding people, including herself, accountable, was still ahead. But for the first time, she felt like she was on the right side of the fight. That evening, Alexandra returned home to find Marcus waiting for her with a bottle of champagne. You did it, he said, his smile warm and proud. We did it, she corrected, sinking into his embrace. As they sat together, the weight of the day began to lift. Alexandra knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, a moment to savor the victory. Because in that moment, she had won not just for herself, but for every voice that had been silenced, every story that had gone untold, every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And for Alexandra Moore, that was worth everything. The days following the board's decision were anything but calm. For every voice celebrating Horizon Air's commitment to change, there was another decrying it. Employees were split, some energized by the reforms, others resentful of what they perceived as unnecessary upheaval. The divide wasn't just ideological, it was deeply personal, rooted in fears, biases, and the kind of quiet resistance that thrives in shadows. Alexandra Moore moved through it all like a woman on a mission. Every meeting, every conversation, every decision was another step forward, another attempt to push against the tide. But the strain was starting to show. Her nights were sleepless, her days an endless cycle of fires to put out. Still, she pressed on. It was during one of those long days, in the middle of yet another meeting, that Evelyn burst into her office. You need to see this, Evelyn said, her voice tight with urgency. She handed Alexandra a tablet, and on the screen was a video. At first, Alexandra couldn't quite make sense of what she was seeing. It was footage from a recent employee training session, one of the first under the new diversity initiative. But the video wasn't about the training itself. It was about the reactions. The camera panned across the room, capturing expressions of disdain, rolled eyes, and whispered comments. Then, it zeroed in on a man, an older employee in a suit. His voice loud and clear. "This is ridiculous," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "I've been here for 30 years. And I've never treated anyone unfairly. This is just a waste of time." The video cut off abruptly. But the damage was already done. It had gone viral, shared not just within the company but across social media. The caption read, "Horizon Air's inclusive future. Is this progress or pandering?" Alexandra felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just a setback, it was a declaration of war from those who refused to change. That evening, as Alexandra prepared for a meeting with the department heads, Harper Jenkins knocked on her door. "Mrs. Moore," Harper began, her voice hesitant but determined. "I saw the video. I wanted to talk to you about it." Alexandra gestured for her to sit. "Go ahead." Harper hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I know the man in the video. He's from my department. And I used to feel the same way he does. But I've realized how wrong I was. I want to help whatever it takes." Alexandra studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. "If you're serious, Harper, you're going to need to speak out. Not just to me, but to your colleagues. They need to hear your story." Harper's eyes widened. "You mean, publicly?" "Yes," Alexandra said. "It's the only way to counter this narrative. People need to see that change is possible, even for those who resisted it at first." The next day, Harper stood at the front of a packed conference room. The room was silent, the tension thick. She looked out at the faces of her colleagues. Some skeptical, some curious, all watching her closely. "I'm not proud of the person I was," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "When this all started, I was angry. I didn't want to believe that bias was a problem here. Because admitting that would mean admitting that I was part of the problem." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But I've realized something. Change isn't about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about being honest with ourselves. About recognizing the ways we've fallen short and choosing to do better." Her words hung in the air. And for a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause spread through the room. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. Harper's speech marked a turning point. Employees who had been on the fence began to engage with the reforms, asking questions, participating in discussions. The resistance didn't disappear, but it began to lose its power, its hold on the company's culture. But the real breakthrough came a week later. During a company-wide event celebrating Horizon Air's anniversary, Alexandra was invited to speak. And as she stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. This company was built on a vision, she began, her voice resonant and clear. A vision of connecting people, of breaking down barriers. But somewhere along the way, we forgot that those values start within our own walls. She looked out at the crowd, her gaze steady. "The changes we've made and will continue to make aren't just about compliance. They're about who we want to be. They're about ensuring that every person who walks through our doors feels seen, valued, and respected." The applause was immediate and thunderous. But Alexandra knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much longer journey. That night, as Alexandra sat in her living room with Marcus, she reflected on the past few months. The battles she had fought, the sacrifices she had made, the people she had inspired. It wasn't easy, and it never would be. But as she looked at Marcus, she knew it was worth it. "You did it," Marcus said, his voice filled with pride. "We did it," Alexandra replied, her hand resting in his. "And we're just getting started." The road ahead would be long, the challenges daunting, but for the first time, Alexandra felt the weight of hope, a hope not just for herself, but for a future where change was not just possible but inevitable.